Hi everyone, it's Mr. Sinti, and today I'd like to talk to you about how plants respond to environmental cues or stresses um, other than light. Because, you know, light is a very important message that plants receive, but they also can pick up and sense things like um, physical pressure. Plants can also detect, for example, gravity. They can also detect temperature, and they can also detect lack of water as well. And so these are, when I say temperature, both hot and cold. So these are some environmental stresses that a plant needs to cope with. And when I say cope with it, again, because plants are planted, they're not really going to modify their behavior in terms of like leaving the area or moving towards something they like or away, like phototaxis or chemotaxis per se. They're going to need to adjust their biochemistry, and they're going to need to maybe adjust their morphology in order to react with this. And so let me start off by talking to you about, like, maybe you're familiar with, like, in a garden, maybe you have this at home. You have a pergola, which is sort of like a little loft, and vines are capable of spiraling themselves around and growing, and that's kind of cool. And it's a great example of how plants adjust their mobility. Sort of not they're rather immobile, but they can make little subtle changes in their development and their physiology in order to sort of adjust with these things. And so I also wanted to point out gravity. Gravity is a really important environmental cue that plants receive, because if you think about it, plants have to know up from down, because shoots need to grow in an upward direction, and that's obvious in order to catch lots of sunlight, and also to be able to capture carbon dioxide, and also to interact with pollinators. And so what's interesting is gravity is a force pressing down toward the earth. And so when shoots show what is called negative gravitropism, or sometimes it's known, instead of gravitropism, it's geo. So it's considered to be negative because it's going against the positive gravity, whereas roots show positive gravitropism, going toward the earth. Now that's important too, obviously, because if you grow downward, you're going to be interacting with soil, and you're going to get lots of water and nutrients that way. So shoots are up, roots are down. And so let me show you a little video clip of this. It's obviously time-lapse. And so you can see here we got a camera on some seeds. And when you take a look, we don't have to even wait a minute. You can take a look. You can notice that the shoot is growing against gravity, so that's showing a negative geotropism, whereas the root, as you can see, is growing downward. And so we have to wonder about this. It's growing down towards the earth, and so they're able to sense gravity. That's right. And so shoots are going up, roots are going down. So I'm going to leave you with this. It's not just gravity that they're sensing. There must be something about gravity. There must be something in the cell, because if the root is growing has to do with cell division, and it has to do with sort of elongation and water moving to particular areas. And that's usually controlled in plants, as you may know, by hormones, like, for example, auxin. So the question really becomes, how does the cells in the root sense the fact that gravity is pushing down, and therefore adjust hormone levels, and therefore adjust cell division? Let's look into that. And so that's our that's our conversation that we're going to be having. And so let's just jump right into that. And so we believe, and I say we believe, that it's not, the book isn't completely finished when it comes to understanding how plants react to gravity, but plants may detect gravity by the settling of little tiny organelles called stalagnoloths. And these structures are specialized plastids. And these plastids, you might be familiar with the most famous plastid of all, not Rudolph, but that's the famous reindeer. The famous plastid of all is a chloroplast, which is green. But plants have a lot of leucoplasts, and this is an example of a leucoplast. And that just means that it's clear or white. And they have these, do you see in this picture, these dark spots right here are grains, these starch grains. And we believe that as a result of gravity, that these stalagmites are falling down as a response to gravity, and the cells are able to react to this. And so check this out. So notice here's a close-up of the root, and here it's growing, and then now look, it's subjected to gravity, and so it's bending toward the earth. So this is positive geotropism. Stagnoliths are moving from here where they're sort of parallel in the cell. Here's the nucleus, and then gravity is sort of pushing them down. So what's the story with this physical pressure? What's happening when these little starch-filled granules touch the membrane? So they collect as a result of gravity in the root, so therefore the root is able to detect direction. And so what's a little complicated is that there's some mutant plants that lack these, and so but they're still capable of growing towards the earth. So it's kind of tricky, but it might be not just these leucoplasts, but there might just be organelles in general, especially the more dense ones, are pushing down on the membrane. Now what's that doing? Pushing down on the cell membrane. Well, inside the root, the root cap itself the cells are mainly dead, but there's this quiescent center, and then there's the apical meristem, the primary meristem. But in these cells, in the root cap, there's these specialized cells called stagnocytes, and they have this stagnoliths inside of them. And those are those amyoplasts. Amyoplasts are basically a type of leucoplast that store starch. And what's the issue with this is that when they're going in a downward direction, what that might do is physically encounter the cell membrane. Now, the complexity of this is pretty advanced, but I'll just toss it out there and see what you think of it. So it pushes down on the cell membrane, and what that does is that it affects a signal transduction mechanism within the cell. So there's some increased protein synthesis, which will then cause auxin, which is a hormone receptor, to be redistributed in the cell membrane. And what's interesting about that is certain locations in the cell will then pick up auxin a little bit more, and therefore there'll be differential growth in a downward direction. I know that's a little tricky, but it's kind of interesting. And so another mechanical sort of stimuli, well, gravity isn't a mechanical stimuli, but this is another type of environmental stimuli is mechanical. It's when you simply touch something, like we were talking about those vines a moment ago, wrapping around the pergola, or grapevines, or beans. This is when a plant wraps around something, or when you touch it and it affects its growth. It's called, this is a mouthful too, THigma, which means sort of wrap around. A blood pressure cuff, when you have your blood pressure taken, is called the THigma Manometer. So a wraparound thigmomorphogenesis. In other words, wrapping around is affecting your morphology. It's going to sort of generate a morphological change. And so basically, look at this. When you rub a plant, it doesn't grow as much as a control one, and that's kind of interesting. And then THigma Tropism is simply a plant responding to, apologize for that, is a plant growing in response to physical touch. Like, for example, if it's growing around another plant, it's wrapping around. So vines employ this THigma Tropism. And so let me show you this. This is kind of cool. Come over here and come down here and show you this. These are some plants. I think they're bean, and what they're doing is when they physically touch something, so a mechanical stimuli, they're able to adjust their growth. It's called THigma Tropism. They're able to wrap around. And like, well, why is the plant doing that? That's a fair question. Well, obviously, I mean, or maybe not, it can use something else, another plant or a stalk or a rock or something as a support. And so that's causing it to move around and it's helping the vine be able to grow up and support itself. That's kind of neat. So THigma Tropism. So let me come back up here. And then we'll look at this. This is one of the classics. This is one of the classics of THigma Tropism. It's called rapid leaf movement in plants. So you thought maybe that THigma Tropism was rapid, but that was under time lapse. Now I'm talking about there's certain plants, the one's called mimosa, that when you touch it, like for example with this red pencil, if you simply brush against it, the leaf is going to rapidly close, kind of like Venus flytrap. It's going to move very quickly. And so what's clear about this right out of the gate is that it's probably some sort of osmosis occurring, and the water is leaving, and therefore the leaves or leaflets lose their turgor pressure and therefore close. And it might be kind of an obvious why a plant might want to rapidly close their leaf. Like for example, if a herbivore was coming, like a deer or an animal brushed against it, it's less desirable if the leaves close up and fall down. So it's sort of a protection against herbaceous predators. But how does it work? How does this rapid leaf movement actually occur? Well, it's a result of physical stimulation. So the physical pressure causes the cells to then be able to move potassium ions. And so what's fascinating about that, it kind of reminds me a little bit of the guard cells in the stomata. The movement of potassium is going to change the osmotic pressure in the cells and in the leaflets. In other words, it's going to become more hypertonic, and then water is going to leave. And then as water leaves, the plant loses its turgor pressure when water leaves the vacuole, and therefore the loss of water causes the leaf to move, and it's very rapid. I'm going to show you a video of that in a second. But what's fascinating is, let me just go right to that video. What's really cool about this, if you've ever seen this before, is, okay, here's just a diagram of what we're dealing with here, is when something touches it, like where something brushes against it mechanically, it's what we like to call this is something called an action potential, because it generates a cascade. In other words, what happens in one part of the plant, like right here, moves down, sort of like an action potential in a neuron, is a change in membrane potential from cell to cell, from synapse to synapse. And what's cool is that movement, that physical movement physical pressure causes potassium to move, and then water moves. And so this is moving along, and so the message gets moved all the way down the leaflet to, and that's cool, like other leaflets get involved, and even the petiole starts to get involved. So isn't that kind of neat? It sort of transfers the message. And that's in real time. This is not time lapse. That's real time. The plant's able to adjust its leaf and close its leaf when you touch it. Isn't that neat? I'm not sure if you knew about that. That's a cool one. Well, in addition to gravity and mechanical things like touching a pergola, or if somebody physically touches or an animal touches the plant, there's other classic environmental stresses. And like what stresses? Well, drought. Obviously, this is the biggest fear plants have, like lack of water, and then maybe too much water, flooding, or too much salt in the soil, or it's too hot out. Sounds like the plants are whining. It's too cold out. So here's something. How does a plant deal with this? Well, if it doesn't deal with drought, it's going to perish. If it's flooded too much, the roots are going to die of lack of oxygen. If there's too much salt, the plant's going to lose water and die. If it's too hot, it's going to wilt and lose too much water. Cold freezes it. So it's like, how can plants, these are examples of plants that can overcome these things. And so drought, again, like what are you going to do if there's no water? What can you do if you're a plant? You can't just pack it up and move to a wetter environment. What are you going to do? Well, I guess you would close your stomata. That's probably the best thing to reduce transpirational loss. Maybe you would stop growing your leaves as much, therefore you wouldn't lose as much water. That's one way to do it. And then another kind of simple trick would be, instead of growing shallow roots, in other words, like sort of lateral, you would go with a sort of primary growth and go deeper. Maybe if you go deeper, you might get some more groundwater, something like that. So again, you're like, well, this is somewhat pathetic. Well, this is why plants don't like the lack of water. Now, what's interesting about this root is that redwood trees, coastal redwood trees, sort of do something a little bit different. They're in an area along the coast of California that lacks water for the most part. Even though way north in California it does rain a lot, it's considered to be a temperate rainforest. But if you go down a little bit like around the Bay Area or south of the Bay Area, it doesn't rain so often. And so how these coastal redwood trees manage is that they grow very short roots. Like when I say short, they don't go very deep. They grow like maybe 15 feet compared to the 300 feet tall that they are. But they grow laterally. And we believe that they grow laterally so that they can soak up all the moisture in the soil up above generated by fog. And so there's a lot of fog that comes in along the Pacific Ocean. And so all that fog kind of accumulates in the forest, and then it literally gets on the needles and drips down, and so the forest floor is kind of moist. And so as you can see, look at the distribution of coastal redwood trees. They don't grow very far inland. So it's about about 300 miles going north-south, but probably not more than 50 miles inland. And so you're like, why is that? Well, they can't survive over here. It's just simply too dry. And so they need the fog. And so they're adapted to the fog drip. And what's interesting here, notice the roots can even sprout up from a burl. This is a new tree can grow, and then a new seedling can grow here. And this would be a clone of the mother tree. And so flooding is kind of the opposite. Like plants really don't like this either. Like if the water's coming in, it'll deprive the root system of oxygen. And so if you look at roots under the microscope and see what's the story, like you can ask yourself, well, here's a lot of water. What's this plant doing in order to survive that? Why is it able to survive flooding and another plant not? And so you can look at sort of a controlled root. Here's the vascular stele. Here's the xylem and the phloem here. Here's the endoderm, and here's the cortex. This is sort of a control root showing like plenty of aeration. This is a root in plants that are been submerged, and so they're lacking oxygen. Look at this. They have controlled death of the cells in their cortex, which generate tubes that will allow oxygen to move through the root system so that the roots don't suffocate. Isn't that incredible? That the cells are programmed to die in a flooding environment in order to help generate oxygen throughout the plant. Salt can be a stress, and you're like, well, why is there so much salt in the soil? Well, if you live close to the ocean, if you live in a salt marsh, for example, and you're like, well, there's not a lot of plants that can live close to the water like that, and the ones that do are called halophytes, like salt. This is sort of, I'm not sure, maybe it's Greek, meaning like salt plant or salt tolerant plant. And so what they do is, you're looking at a close-up here, is basically like us. When we sweat, we release a little bit of our electrolytes, a little bit of a salt onto the outside of our skin. So these plants do this as well. They release salt. This is salty water on the outside of the leaf. And then when it dries up, it's sort of like white powder. You can flake it off. A classic example of this is a salt marsh plant called saltwort, and you can find this growing around the Bay Area a lot. Like for example, here's the ocean, and then water comes in. So this is a salty marsh kind of environment, and some plants, halophytes, can handle this. Not every plant can. Like you're not going to be able to come over here and grab one of these oaks and plant it right next to the salt marsh. It's going to die. But some of these plants can handle that. And so it's fascinating. You could look at the strata and sort of look at the adaptations that plants have dealing with salt and dealing with different environmental conditions. Kind of cool. And then heat is an issue too. If it gets too hot, what are you going to do? Again, you're probably not going to survive, but some plants can handle it. So there's different things. You can close your stomata to prevent water loss, but on a biochemical level, what's interesting is that you may know that proteins are sensitive to intense heats. Like for example, the protein will lose its shape or its conformation, and therefore it won't function effectively. We found in some plants that can tolerate this extreme heat is that they have proteins that surround other proteins. They're like little chaperones like this, and so they protect proteins from experiencing so much heat. They're sort of like little mittens that you would put on when you're pulling out your cookies from the oven. They prevent the enzymes from being denatured, which they normally would. So they're heat shock proteins. Isn't that crazy? It's kind of cool. And then finally, cold is an issue, and you're like, what are you going to do if it freezes? Well, one of the biggest concerns about freezing is that if the phospholipid bilayer becomes solid, the proteins that are embedded in it won't be able to function. They won't be able to scoot around. They won't be able to act as ion channels or enzymes, or they won't be able to facilitate diffusion. And so what plants can kind of do is adjust their lipid makeup, and in other words, increase their polyunsaturated fatty acids in order to maintain fluid mobility in the phospholipid bilayer to an extent. If it's too cold, the plant will simply perish. So I hope you enjoyed our conversation about different environmental influences and stresses and how plants react to these environmental stresses other than light. Thanks for watching.